listeners, and welcome to another episode of Get Smarter, the LCE podcast. I'm here today with John Cray. He's a senior principal consultant with LCE with over 40 years of experience with demonstrated results in maintenance management, reliability engineering, and corporate reliability leadership. John also has extensive technical safety, CMMS, and organizational change management experience. John has also been on our podcast before, and let me tell you what, there's nobody I'd rather spill the reliability with. Yeah, do you see what I did there? Okay, so welcome to the podcast, John. It's your second appearance on Get Smarter. For those of you that haven't listened to the podcast we produced with John and the reliability legend, Ron Moore, we talked about the connection between reliable operations and how it impacts safety in other areas of the operation. So I encourage you to listen to that podcast. It's titled Safety First, Reliability Always. We'll remind you at the end of the episode. But today, John, thank you for joining us again.
Good to be here.
Awesome. So in today's episode, we're going to discuss a recent experience of John's. He was on site facilitating a reliability transformation at a food manufacturing facility. So I'm just going to let the listeners know this podcast is going to be a bit of a departure from some of our previous episodes. We are going to call it John Cray's Storytime Corner. I know John hates that, but no, seriously, we're going to listen to a real life account of a transformation and all that entails. So John, thanks for being here and for being willing to share your experience. But I want to start off with, let's start the story with the current state of the operations that you walked into. Can you just describe that for me?
Sure. These were two food processing plants, very large in scale, and they were located in two different states. And they had been making improvements over the years, but they still needed to produce more product to meet demand. And they were, I would say, moderately reactive operating environments.
Can you talk to me about what that means?
They
Moderately reactive?
Yeah, so most people are familiar with the term OEE, overall equipment effectiveness. It's a measure of uptime, throughput rate, and quality yield.
Right.
And they had, I would say, above average OEE performance compared to many of our clients. So they were performing pretty well. And so the converse of that is that they were experiencing some equipment and process interruptions, but they were doing reasonably well, but still needed to improve to meet customer demand.
Right.
So LCE was invited in to take a look at their operations and assess how they were doing. And so what we do, we do an on-site visit for about a week. We call it a wave 1, wave 2, where we do an on-site education session. So we did this at each site, and then we do what we call wave 2 assessment, where we interview a cross-section of the organization at each plant. So we spend a week at one plant and a week at another plant. We collect some data while on site, and we also off-site collect some OEE and financial data. And we do a reliability assessment of each operation, and then a business case to determine what's the economic value of making reliability improvements. So when we were invited in, they were doing reasonably well, but they needed to improve their OEE to meet customer requirements, as I said. And so when we did the assessment at each site, what we determined is that each plant was operating basically independent of each other. They had a common software platform, but they were not taking full advantage of their software platform, nor were they really leveraging solutions between the two operating plants. They were really culturally treated as standalone individual operations that didn't interact very well with each other.
But their equipment and their processes or the way they were supposed to run their equipment and processes quite similar, right? I mean, they
Yes,
were making a
absolutely.
similar product or,
They were making, yeah, they're certainly making identical products, a little bit different, technology involved, but fundamentally they were the exact same.
and so
And
they weren't talking to each other, they weren't sharing best practices or
on a very limited basis. Okay.
okay.
And with that, they weren't really taking advantage of their common software platform that where they were capturing all their maintenance and reliability information. And matter of
Right, their
fact,
work order history, their failure rates and, or breakdowns and all that juicy stuff reliability engineers like.
correct. So yeah, they were underutilizing a very sophisticated software program. We provided that assessment for from each plant to their corporate leadership and plant leadership. We certainly presented to them an individual business case for each plant to make the reliability improvements. And at each plant, the fundamental business case was by increasing production
Hmm.
with a moderate cost reduction from reducing breakdowns. They could justify the investment in a reliability improvement program for each site.
Wow.
So the other thing that led to then was approval to move forward. So we formed a reliability project encompassing both plants at the same time. So we formed individual leadership teams for a reliability project at each plant.
So
And
this is
we
interesting because this could introduce a little sibling rivalry, if you will.
Yes. So, well, it's sibling rivalry, but also when we formed each reliability leadership team at each plant, it became apparent to each other that they were all in this together. In other
Yeah.
words, they're both going through the same activities. Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so we started off preparing the leadership for what was the scope of work, how we were going to go about developing and implementing a reliability improvement project. And I would like to add that this took place early in the COVID pandemic.
Oh, wow. Okay. So were there any like site visit restrictions or
Absolutely site visit restrictions. Our
wow.
normal course of action when we're doing these reliability improvement projects is to have our consultants show up on site.
Hmm.
So we had to kick off the reliability improvement preparation activities with the leadership team remotely
Virtually.
using
Wow. Hmm.
video conferencing software.
Hmm.
The client very much supported this. Being a food operation, they were very sensitive to having outside people coming into their
Absolutely.
site in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. So they committed to doing this remotely. So first thing we did is we prepared each of the teams, stressing that their role is to oversee the project for each of their plants and to develop and implement the organizational change management plan, or in simple terms, the people plan for the reliability transformation. The objective as far as getting the plants to collaborate, we recommended and they agreed that we would form focus teams for doing work management, materials management, and reliability engineering. And instead of doing them independently at each of the two locations, we formed a joint two-plant focus team for work management, likewise for materials management and reliability engineering, comprised of members from each of the plants and some corporate members.
Nice.
And we call that a global design workshop.
Hmm.
And we did that remotely, again, given that it was early stages of COVID.
Hmm.
And we did all of our work through a video conferencing software that they preferred to use. And we utilized LCE's Smarter application in this because all of LCE's best practice information for these three work streams, as you know, are located in Smarter. So we utilize Smarter across the enterprise, and the three focus teams developed their one common solution for work management, materials management, reliability engineering. We got those processes approved by
Mm-hmm.
plant leadership and corporate.
Mm-hmm.
And when that activity was done, we, LCE, uploaded their product back into LCE Smarter.
I was just going to ask, so in this case, but it's a, a best practice for other organizations, you utilize all of the online options, right? That
Abs-
you had and collaboration tools. And you brought this organization together.
Bragging a little bit, but we normally do that in person, and here we are faced with the national and international dilemma of COVID,
Yes.
plus their sensitivities to bringing in people that were not employees onto their property. Yeah, they committed to doing this remotely using all the online collaborative tools, and it went off very well. We didn't spread this out over months. We did this a very intensive 5 days a week for a couple of weeks to get this developed. And then we got the products that they finalized for their self uploaded in a Smarter. And the key thing is now they have one common solution applied to both sites.
Right. They have a place where they can log in and see their operations and the playbook, the rules of the game, right? All together. And and they can educate. They can educate their folks on, okay, this is the way that we do things now.
Correct.
Yeah.
And as of course, as you know, in Smarter, we have e-learning courses. So
Mm-hmm.
both sites are now taking the same identical e-learning courses at a self-paced approach.
Right.
So now
When
they
they
have a
can, when they have time. And so they have the language of
yes,
reliability across the organization. Yeah.
absolutely. So with the global design workshop completed and approved and uploaded into Smarter, we began to then work on the implementation preparation activities. We began that remotely,
Mm-hmm.
and after about a month, really two things took place. One, their level of concern for non-employees to come on site dropped, and so we were then allowed or authorized to come visit the plants. So we LCE consultants started traveling to the individual plants and began to meet people in person, face to face, which is always a good thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
And then number two, because the same consultants would travel to one plant one week, and then the second week they would go to the second plant. So we were bouncing back and forth between the plants. So the same people were seeing both sites implementation preparation activities. And then as we were doing that, I was really pleased with this. The individual leadership teams started to realize, well, we're all doing the same activities. Why don't we have a joint leadership team? So the two plant leadership teams, led by, sponsored by each individual site manager, the site managers thought that was a great idea. And so we started having video conferencing meetings to status the project with both sponsors on the call as well
Mm-hmm.
as the department leadership on the call. So now you have leaders from both locations collaborating and dialoguing about the challenges of implementing a reliability improvement program. So they realized that we're not unique, we're all in this together, and they started sharing best practices amongst themselves. And it was then became a little bit of a friendly competition because certainly one department didn't want to report out that they were lagging behind the others. So that little bit of what I like to call uh,
Motivation,
competition,
right? It's
positive
motivation.
competition was a excellent motivator.
Do you feel like this operation had challenges that were, you know, absolutely unique, or were there some things that, I mean, John, you've been doing this a long time. Were there some things that you found are were were common that you see um when you embark on these initiatives that are kind of common struggles that organizations have when they first get started out? Because what I'm hearing is some excellent best practices on, especially if you have multiple operations, on who are, especially when they're producing the same product, who are uniquely positioned to collaborate, that is a best practice, that, sharing or collaborating with leadership teams across an organization, getting the operation together to agree on what best practice looks like, even if plants have a different way of getting there, because
Right.
they may be at different maturity levels. We didn't talk about this a whole lot, but in the assessment, I know that there are different maturity levels. It goes from really reactive to what is called emerging, and then proactive, and then excellent. But a best practice I thought I heard you say, was getting the teams together to collaborate on what good looks like,
Correct.
and then
Correct.
working together, to get there. But are there some common challenges that you see when people are getting started that we need to overcome in order to
Sure.
get better? And could you share that?
Sure. So again, this is a story about a reliability transformation,
Hmm.
and regardless of industry, whether it's food, metals,
Life
paper,
sciences.
life sciences, okay, all those different kinds of industries have a lot of common types of problems from a reliability perspective. One in particular is most organizations have some form of a sophisticated software package for managing maintenance and reliability. And what's a common
It's a
problem,
four-letter word, right? CMMS or
CMMS,
EAMS.
yes,
Some
and
people
and
may
there's,
say it's a bad word, but
but
it's not. It can power your operation, right? It gives you so
right.
much information if you can harness it. Hmm.
So most organizations that we encounter buy a sophisticated, i.e., expensive piece of software, and they underutilize it. What they really wind up doing, not on purpose, but by default, is they implement their current state in a new software package, as
Oh,
opposed
okay.
to
Sorry, that was they implement their current state
in the
in a
new
software
software.
packet. Yeah,
Yes,
where when they have an opportunity to set the bar.
higher,
Yeah.
absolutely, and so that's a common issue across clients in multiple industries. People are
Yeah.
not unique, or organizations are not unique in that regard. The site-specific problems, again, regardless of plant and industry, as you mentioned earlier, the starting points
Hmm.
are always unique. Everybody is a little different. They got their own individual site quirks, if you will. The other common problem that we run across is, and certainly this was the case with these two food operations, is again, you have a sophisticated software package. They were doing manual metrics out of it, reporting within the site. And those metrics had different definitions and different variables relative to maintenance and reliability.
Okay.
Okay. So if you're a corporate person and
Right.
site A tells you, oh, we're 5% reactive maintenance, and site B says, oh, we're 10% reactive maintenance. In reality, neither site is measuring that to best practice. Okay.
Right.
And certainly there's nobody asking the questions, what is the proper definition?
Correct. They're
So
interpreting
what's
the data differently, right? So they're pulling it down into a spreadsheet or
correct?
something.
Yes.
And, they could be using, well, now they could be using BI or, whatever tool, but the way that they're interpreting that data is different. Hmm.
Yeah. So again, a common problem is the lack of best practice metrics. and then very much site/manually manipulated. And so part of the transformation is when we standardize work processes, the same for both sites, for, again, work management, materials management, and reliability engineering.
Hmm.
With that comes a standard set of best practice metrics. And LCE worked with the corporate folks to configure the metrics in software so that they would have a common set of metrics based on best practice definitions that both sites would be utilizing. So now you have one metric with one definition based on one set of variables that each site will report automatically. And they used one of these offline reporting tools, like you mentioned, Power BI, Tableau, those type of
Right.
brands. Okay. But now managers have a screen on their computer with a set of defined best practice metrics that they not only can see their own site's performance, but they can also look up the other site's performance as well. So back to that positive competition, if you will.
Right, but it's transparency and common ground, right? And
Right.
there's power in that. There's organizational strength in that. There's resilience, I think, in that.
Well, when you sit there and say, okay, here are the best practice metrics, and again, those best practice metrics are in our LCE Smarter, and we
And aligned
apply,
with SMRP, the Society of
correct,
Manufacturing and Reliability Professionals, as a body of guidance, the GFMAM, and those are the bodies that define
sure.
what those best practices are.
So when you have a best practice metric defined and configured in the reporting tool, now you're getting ground truth,
Yeah.
right? And all of a sudden, oh, we're not 4-8% reactive maintenance. We're now 25,
25.
30%.
That's what I'm
Okay.
saying.
And but with that is you're exposing reality,
Yeah.
and people may grumble about, oh, gee, I'm not as good as I thought I was.
But
But
now they know the problems to solve,
now you
right?
have an honest baseline based on data,
Yeah.
okay, not opinion and not individual manipulations. And now you have an opportunity to say, okay, how do we make that better? What's driving our level of reactivity?
Right.
Because the higher reactivity, it certainly affects your OEE or your production.
Your
So,
capacity.
so a unique problem, before we change off this subject, is these two plants were trained how to use their CMMS, their computerized maintenance management systems, but not completely trained. So we always look at work order backlog and measure
Hmm.
that and manage from it. Of course, that's a best practice. But they also had work requests backlog. And for me, there's usually a handful or two of open work requests that need to be addressed. And so when we were trying to clean up their backlogs, they asked me, well, which backlog do you want?
Oh,
And I said, well, I want the work order backlog, of course.
right.
And they said, well, we have a work request backlog.
And that
Well,
means
that,
the work requests that haven't been approved and put into the actual work order backlog.
well, maybe not. So maybe and maybe not. A lot of it, it turns out, when we got the work request backlog,
Uh-huh.
okay, what their system required is that you had to close both the work order and the work request. Okay. They had not been taught to close work
Oh, they
requests.
didn't close the
So
work
they had
request.
thousands of old work requests that they had responded to and had a
Wow.
corresponding work order, but no one had ever said, oh, you have to go in there and close that as well.
Nobody cleaned it up.
So we do our normal common
Hmm.
problem is cleaning up the work order backlog and making it a usable tool to manage by. But
Hmm.
we also had, and they responded very well to cleaning up a huge work request backlog. So long story short, with that fundamental change, knowledge and awareness and ability, their typical work request backlog was 5 to 10 open work orders that they were now transacting on a daily basis. Quite a change, right? But once they knew what was required, they responded very well. And so that aspect was rather unique for them. Okay.
Yeah.
But again, a common problem is just taking your standard work order backlog and getting it cleaned up and being a usable tool by which to manage your work by.
No, I think that's a really important thing for our listeners to hear. So, this may have been a unique situation to how
Right.
this operation was using their CMMS, but I cannot tell you, especially with people who come through our institute, or customers that we interact with, that the CMMS or whatever you're using to help you manage your maintenance and reliability program data is 80-90% of the time underutilized
Mm-hmm.
and inconsistently utilized,
Yes,
right?
and we find fairly often not configured to best practice as well. And one simple example for the listeners is most all CMMSs have a field to configure your priorities and a field to configure your work types. And what's a common problem is mixing those two up so that a priority should be a time-directed category, and a work
Okay.
type is obviously,
A
what type of work are you
classification,
doing? A classification, whether it's corrective work, breakdown work, preventive work, condition-based monitoring work, right?
capital, whatever.
Capital,
Yeah.
exactly. So we find that in a lot of cases, priorities and work type get mixed together and should really be separated. And they're easy to fix in most software systems to reconfigure those fields,
Hmm.
but that's a common problem as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. Well, oh my gosh. I've had so much to take from our conversation just thus far, and we haven't even talked about the change management side yet, the people side.
Correct.
So, but for our listeners, I just want to kind of recap. So we had two sites, similar in nature. It it reminds me of Juliet, Romeo and Juliet, two houses in Fair Verona. Um, but they came together during the COVID pandemic, which was, a challenge in and of itself, virtually using a common platform to design their best practices around work management, materials management, and reliability engineering. We have investigated some common challenges that they faced, especially when starting out, some best practices around unifying their processes of what good looks like, and then the leadership sharing and supporting their journeys, as they go. Common measures based on best practice are important. CMMS data stewardship, as well as configuring and defining how they should be using the system, not to duplicate or mirror their current state, but to raise the bar, use it as a tool to help them do that. For our listeners, though, if you'd like to explore more about the topic, go to lc.com, go to the resource library, check out our previous podcast with reliability legend Ron Moore. He'd probably hate if I called him that, but he truly is, and a gracious guest, and John Cray, or the article, A Reliable Plant is a Safe Plant is a Cost-Effective Plant. If you want to know more about assessments, about dissatisfaction with the current state, just email us, at info@lc. We can help you, whether you want to take on the assessment yourself, whether you want our help. We've done this before, but we're here for you if you need us. So thanks again, John, so much for joining us today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. So again, stay smarter, listeners. We'll see you next time.